Good evening. And I'm Dayna Cunningham, the Dean of Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts. This is the first Tisch College Solomont Speaker Series of the semester. It's a conversation with March for Our Lives co-founder David Hogg, moderated by our own Abby Kiesa. It's an honor to welcome David to the campus, and it is a distinct pleasure to gather and learn with all of you this evening. Before we get started, I want to thank our event co-sponsors, the Civic Studies Program, Political Science Department, Tufts Civic, and the Tufts Democrats. Your collaboration, along with your support and leadership of Susan and Alan Solomont, make events like this one possible. In fact, I'm delighted to have Alan Solomont, Dean Emeritus of the Tisch College, and generous benefactor of the speaker series here with us tonight. And a warm welcome as well to proud Jumbo and Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. This year, for the first time, Tisch College is centering the Solomont Speaker Series around a theme, and the theme is the fight for democracy. Our democracy, as you know, has endured countless attacks in recent years. Attacks on the integrity of our elections, through dismantling of voting rights and voting systems, attacks on our libraries and schools, including dismantling of curriculum and calls for bans on books that center topics like race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Deliberate attacks of misinformation seeking to undermine our democratic institutions, encouraging disillusionment and depressing participation and hope. Here at Tisch College, we're inspired by those who, in the face of these attacks, are actively engaged in the fight to protect, expand, and improve our democracy and our institutions. Steve Simon said earlier today, we're in the democracy business. And I like that, we're in the democracy business. This semester will address these crucial issues with civic leaders from all walks of life who are fighting for democracy by working to preserve and expand voting rights, pushing back on misinformation campaigns, supporting workers' rights, defending the public's access to information, and more. We hope you will join us as we welcome these diverse leaders throughout the semester. Please visit the Tisch College website for our full schedule of fall speakers and events. Now for this evening's event. We could not have a more fitting start to this semester's theme than David Hogg. Passionate in his advocacy to end gun violence, David's mission of increasing voter participation, civic engagement, and activism embraces a range of issues in the fight for democracy. David was a senior at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida on February 14, 2018, when a lone gunman opened fire, killing 17 of his friends, classmates, and teachers. Committed to becoming an agent for change, he resolved that no other young person should have to experience the tragic impact of gun violence. Alongside his classmates, David co-founded March for Our Lives, which has become one of the largest youth-led movements in the world. Just 5 weeks after the shooting, March for Our Lives mobilized one of the biggest demonstrations in the nation's history. Since then, David's activism has taken him around the country, meeting with impacted families and diverse communities to deepen his knowledge of gun safety and the politics of ending gun violence. With his younger sister, Lauren, also a student at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and a survivor of the shooting, He co-wrote #NeverAgain, a New York Times bestseller. His call to get over politics and get something done challenges Americans to stand up, speak out, and work hard to elect morally just leaders, regardless of party affiliation. I have to say, I heard David on the Lawrence O'Donnell show, and Lawrence was actually moping about the state of American politics, and you took him to school and talked about the importance of optimism and really focusing on all the wins. It was quite a multi-generational educational experience, let me just say. Now 22 and a senior at Harvard University, David's activism has only increased, evolving to meet the needs of the current political climate and to build a movement that fights for change wherever it can be found. We are grateful that he is here to speak with us on these crucial topics. In conversation today with David is Abby Kiesa, Deputy Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, CIRCLE. Abby joined CIRCLE in 2005 after working with students across the country to focus on maintaining a conversation between research and practice. She has worked on several major research projects and evaluations while at CIRCLE, as well as on several partnerships to support growing voters for a more equitable electorate. This includes the CIRCLE Growing Voters Report, which launched this past summer and is aimed at supporting nonpartisan youth electoral learning and engagement, including recommendations for K-12 schools, community organizations, parents, families, election officials, policymakers, and young leaders. Abby is well-versed in the wide range of youth civic and political engagement efforts and practice, and she brings a broad view of the institutions and interventions that can make up ecosystems for civic development among all youth, including those often left out of the conversation. Thanks to Abby and David for kicking off this semester's speaker series with us. I'm looking forward to the conversation. One final note here before I hand it over to Abby. Tufts Civic, one of tonight's co-sponsors and a nonpartisan student group that aims to generate meaningful political discourse on campus, is hosting a small discussion group for students in the terrace room in Page Hall immediately following the event as part of its Continuing the Conversation series. Students who would like to continue the conversation among their peers, debrief the content of the event, and delve deeper into the topic at hand are encouraged to head to Page and join the informal conversation. Thank you all for being with us, and please join me in welcoming Abby and David.
Thank you so much, Dean Cunningham. And thank you all for being here today and joining us for what I hope to be a really amazing conversation.
It will be.
All right, guarantee right here. Frankly, I'm a little bit shocked that my colleagues at Tisch College gave me a microphone in front of lots of people, but we'll see what happens.
So am I.
David, thank you so much for being here. We at CIRCLE are such big followers of you.
I'm a big follower of you guys.
And
You're
your
amazing.
Work. And you know, we have a lot to talk about. And hopefully we can get a little bit below the surface. I would like to begin with a question about you before February 2018. I have a habit of listening to a podcast that starts with this question about someone's spiritual background. But let's take a twist on that and ask about your civic or political background pre-February 2018.
Well, before I go into that, I just want to say thank you to CIRCLE. You seriously. Yeah, I don't know if you all understand what a big role, and I'm not just saying this to be like, wow, you all are amazing or whatever. No, seriously, CIRCLE has played an instrumental role in enabling March for Our Lives to do what we've done. I've talked about them I've never known actually anybody from CIRCLE. I've just known CIRCLE, the Twitter account. It has been enormously helpful. And honestly, it is needed way more. So if any of you guys, and I'm not saying this, if you really want to contribute to the movement, beyond donating, if anybody in the room would like to do that, go go and help Circle, like go and work there. Like they are so useful. They've been really enormously impactful in a way that words cannot begin to describe the amount of help that you have provided us in informing us of the right way to, we helped because of the information that Circle provided in 2018. We used part of that data to go out and turn out young people in congressional districts against the NRA. And we defeated more NRA-backed politicians than ever before in American history because of some of their research. Don't clap for me, clap for them. So thank you for that. But to answer your question, go and work for them. To answer your question, I think the person that I was before everything happened was just somebody, both my parents were civil servants. My mom's been a teacher and predominantly, Title I lower income schools for almost 30 years now. And my dad was in federal law enforcement as well. So I'd been shooting guns since I was basically in 4th grade. And, for those of you that think I'm just some gun grabbing liberal, it's, yeah, I grew up literally seeing my dad clean his guns all the time after shooting quals, which most people in the room that have parents in law enforcement can relate to. Mm-hmm. But I think my background was, I didn't really identify as I thought both political parties like just sucked, honestly. And I just thought both of them are corrupt in their own unique way. I was very cynical. So my way of getting into that was like student journalism kind of, because both my parents had incredible stories growing up, and for me, one of the things that I struggled with was I have dyslexia and ADD. So I was in a lot of special ed classes throughout elementary and middle school. And when I got into high school, I'd started in the middle of my freshman year in California, where I lived for 14 years. And my family moved out to South Florida because my father has Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. We couldn't really afford to live in California anymore if he had to medically retire. So we moved out to Florida because it was cheaper and we had family there. And when I moved there, as you can imagine, moving in the middle of high school, for anybody that has done that, it sucks. I struggled a lot to find my own story. So I started using my camera as an excuse to be anywhere, basically. It's like the ultimate hall pass. Any high schoolers in the audience can use that. Just bring a camera anywhere. So I didn't need to have that many friends to go to a football game or go to prom or whatever. I could just have, my camera. And I just found it really satisfying to go after the man, or whoever I thought was in power, like, our principal, for example, when there weren't enough textbooks or whatever, and like, trying to do a random hit piece on him that was like the stupidest thing ever. But just stuff like that. And I just really enjoyed telling other people's stories because of that and using my camera as my excuse to be anywhere at any time. And as a result, like, I struggled a lot with insecurity when I was younger about my own writing ability, because I couldn't really read until I think it was 3rd or maybe even 5th grade. I don't even remember. But I really struggled to learn how to read, and I became really insecure because of that. And I joined in middle school, or after middle school, towards the end, I applied to join my high school debate team because I wanted to basically stick it to the people that, thought like, because I couldn't spell whatever word, I was an idiot, and prove that I was smart. So I joined the debate team, and that's how I started learning about the NRA. That's how I learned about all these different policies and having to argue on both sides of it. Debate kids are some of the worst kids on the planet. I say that as a debate kid, and anybody who was in it will tell you the same. That's kind of my introduction. Is I just really liked, I just had a really strong sense of just, I don't care what party you are, at least at the time I didn't. I feel like things have really changed massively in the time since. But I just thought, like, I just care that you do the right thing and that you help support kids like the people, the young people that my mom works with in her schools, because those are the kids that need support, right? That you help, do good to help people, and just do the right thing. Bottom line, right? That shouldn't be political. And that's really what I was committed to.
Got it. Thank you for explaining that. You've mentioned schools several times. And I think you know very well that Circle focuses a lot on in-school civic education. We know that, Florida passed a really big law in 2010 called the Sandra Day O'Connor Act that theoretically should have influenced your schooling, or you're part of that generation. So what do you remember from any civic ed in school, or what would you have liked to see?
Well, honestly, I got to say, I think while civic education is important for me, I love learning, but I hate school. Got to be honest. Like I love reading and learning about stuff and talking about it, but I don't like deadlines to the point that like if I'm assigned readings, I actively, even if I wanted to do them previously, I don't want to do them, to be honest, because it feels like work. It's weird.
I get that.
And so for me, I think for context, like I didn't go to middle school in Florida, which is where that law really impacts from my understanding.
Well,
But
high school too. Yeah.
it helped a lot of my classmates more than anything.
Okay.
They've said that. But for me, I think the biggest thing that helped my civics education was watching Last Week Tonight by John Oliver.
Excellent.
And like that was my liberal indoctrination right there. Education. Whoa. And from that, like that's part of how I started learning about the NRA through speech and debate and stuff like that. And really, I think it was speech and debate that was kind of my civics education, more than anything. And from the applications of that and watching things like The Daily Show and Last Week Tonight in a funny format where it feels like, yes, the world's falling apart, but like let's laugh as we're watching it burn, right? That was kind of my civics education. Obviously, I do think civics education is critically important and should be standardized like across the country. But yeah, I think my education outside of school through those shows actually played just as much of a role, if not more, than actual school itself.
That's fantastic.
Which may not be what you want to hear, but
we talk a lot about people having different pathways. So I think what you're talking about is that we need a broad range of influences. My favorite part of John Oliver in 2020 was the last episode where he just like walks away from a giant 2020 sign and it blows up. Yeah,
yes,
that was pretty wonderful and dark. So I don't want to go very much further without acknowledging the, as Dean Cunningham did, the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And I think everyone involved in planning this really wants to honor that event by having some conversations about action.
Yeah,
including the more than 31,000 individuals who've died from gun violence just this year. So thinking about the action that you and your peers took, can you tell us about some of the key moments in the development of March for Our Lives? Like, was that just one person's idea and y'all were on text chain and you just went with it? Or were there iterations of, I don't know what we want to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just us being so angry after everything happened that we decided that we had to do something. For me, that motivation came from the fact that my sister had lost 4 friends that day. And she wasn't in the building where it happened. And neither was I, because our school is a different layout than most schools. It's an outdoor school. So I heard gunshots and I was next to the building where it was happening. But when you're in these instances, you don't know what is going on, right? You don't know if there are multiple shooters. You don't know if there are bombs on campus. You don't know what it is. And I think the real motivation that we had to start going was just that we didn't feel like we could do anything else, right? We're not just going to sit back and do nothing. We were all mad as hell as teenagers, and we're like, no, like we're not going to take it anymore. Like we're going to do this. So, against what all of our parents pretty much wanted, we went out and mobilized. And I think part of us also knew, at least the ones that were in TV production and stuff, that like in the darkest way possible, that school shootings have a very limited time span in our rapid news cycle, where the president is going off the rails half the time on Twitter back then. And we had to mobilize to take control of that narrative ourselves and not let talking heads just debate it on CNN or Fox News or whatever the hell, and just let that story die and let our classmates die with it in vain with no change coming from it, right? Because we knew that there was nothing that we could do to bring our classmates back, but we knew that there was something that we could do to possibly help stop this from happening in the future. So that's why we mobilized so quickly. And that came from really a group chat that was started by one of our friends. We just started meeting up on the living room floor and talking about it. And honestly, like a lot of it's a blur, like because we were so exhausted that a lot of those memories never encoded, because we were sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night and we were constantly sick because of everything that we were going through and everything that we were processing, as we were also being re-traumatized by the media.
Of course. So can we talk a little strategy here? Because, I think there's a lot of conversation often about, are young people going to buy into institutions? They're going to trust institutions, or they're going to always work outside of institutions? We just kind of hear that binary a lot. How did y'all decide in what way you wanted to focus, in what strategies you wanted to use to try to create change?
Well, I mean, it's like, how are you going to change gun laws if you don't change the government, right? Or pressure the government? Like that's the bottom line. For other people, like there are changes that you may want to make outside of government, but specifically for us, we wanted to change gun laws. It's kind of hard to change gun laws if you aren't willing to work with the government in some way, shape, or form. That's the bottom line, right? So that was the strategy that happened there. And we just knew that it just seemed like the thing to do. Is like the clear, when we look at other movements like the civil rights movement or others, and you model it off of, that, of course, there are elements of that are outside the government, but the element that we were interested in was how to change gun laws at the state level. And that's why we just started organizing people to vote, to register to vote and everything like that, and working on the inside. I think the important thing that we did though, is we didn't say, you need to go out and vote because it's your civic duty. And like whatever, just whatever mumbling nonsense that we constantly hear, where it's like, okay, like we've heard this 8,000 damn times. What is actually different? Why does this actually matter? What we said is they don't want you to vote. The Ron DeSantis's of the world, the Rick Scotts of the world do not want you to vote. And I'll tell you why we know that, because and why your vote matters. Because if it didn't, in Florida, when you sent in your mail-in ballot, my mail-in ballot, when I registered to vote, I registered through Motor Voter when I was 16. I thought I was signing a receipt. I was actually signing my driver's license. So if my signature on my mail-in ballot doesn't match verbatim to that signature, my ballot would get thrown out. And as a result, like 20% or something insane, just in Parkland alone, of students' ballots that were mailed in were thrown out, right? Because whose signatures change the most, right? Young people. So by framing it as they don't want you to vote, and yes, voting isn't the entire answer, but it has to be part of it. That's how we just tapped into what teenagers do best, which is not listen to the adults, and reframed it.
So just out of curiosity, how does standing up and interrupting a legislative hearing fit into this philosophy?
Well, I think in that, which time are you talking about?
Maybe that's my point.
Okay. Well, if you're talking about this summer in the judiciary hearing that I got hauled out of, I mean, look, the bottom line is this, like, there were Republicans bringing up straw man arguments constantly about opioids, about immigration, about all this other stuff in a judiciary hearing about assault weapons. It's like, okay, I agree. The Sackler family is terrible, and Harvard should absolutely take its name off of the $400 million art museum they use as a tax write-off for that cartel of a family. But sorry. Yeah. Anyways, it's like, so I'm in this hearing, right? And we're sitting with the families from Uvalde and Highland Park and all this stuff, right? Really emotionally charged stuff, horrible. Throughout, unfortunately, as a consequence of a lot of this work, I've deemed it necessary to read a lot of these mass shooters manifestos to understand the thought process. I do not recommend any of you do that. It's just something that I've felt like I've had to do to understand why would somebody do this in any way, shape, or form beyond mental illness. And what I've realized is, oh, they're not mentally ill. They're racist white men for the most part. And that, the shooter at my high school was an anti-Semitic, literal Nazi. That is not a mental illness. The entire Third Reich was not mentally ill. That is a product of learned systemic racism and being able to be armed as part of armed supremacy to get an AR-15 as a 19-year-old that threatened to shoot up a school multiple times and was still able to keep it, right? I don't want to hear about how you're, oh, like this is just a disturbed individual. Yes, he's disturbed in that he is a white supremacist. Anyways, the point that I was getting at there before I started just ranting about all the different multitude of intersectional factors.
Yeah, we're going to get back to that.
But is that the reason why I interrupted that hearing is because those same Republicans that were on that thing kept saying Hispanic invasion, Hispanic invasion, Hispanic invasion, Mexican invasion. Horrible, right? And literally they act as if, oh, like, I used to be a lot more bipartisan, be like, yes, like we can work together. But here's the thing. They're literally reiterating the points of half the mass shooters that I've read in their manifestos that call it a Hispanic invasion over and over again. And sure, you may not be inspiring those people, but if you were saying the same thing that mass shooters are saying, maybe you shouldn't be saying that thing. And I don't give a damn what party you're part of. Shouldn't be saying that. And if that means me interrupting you and calling you out because you are literally inspiring the next mass shooter using your platform, yeah, I'm going to call you out. And I don't care if it means I'm getting arrested or hauled out of Congress, because you shouldn't be there. That's the bottom line. It's not to say Democrats are perfect either, but at least we aren't espousing white supremacist talking points in Congress.
So at the beginning of Dean Cunningham's remarks, she talked about Tisch College, really focusing on this fight for democracy. And in my own view, this fight for democracy is a fight for a multiracial society, right? Without white supremacy. And there's so many issues ingrained in that. You've talked about immigration, right? You've talked about just basic racial justice. How, there are a lot of students in the room. What advice would you have for students on how to think about what to do to have an impact on the world? You have picked one issue, right? That's very interconnected to a lot of issues. Does someone have to pick one issue?
Well, I think unfortunately our country is so messed up isn't the right word, because so many of these things are intentionally, like they're products of the system. They're not symptoms or side effects. They are the products of the system. That I think unfortunately you don't pick these issues, the issues pick you. Does that make sense? Right? Like every organizer I've ever met, activism is not voluntary. It's something that people have to do for their survival. There's a reason the best organizer, the reason why March for Our Lives exists isn't because of me. It's because of the gay women within the movement that enabled it to exist in the first place. Because there are all these different vignettes of injustice and horrifying things that happen where people literally have to organize for their survival. So I don't think it's a matter of necessarily going out there and picking like, oh yes, like today I'm going to have some of the arugula racial injustice, and then or whatever. Like it's not like a buffet where you're going and picking it. It's like you were being picked by it by whatever your life experiences are. For me, that was my own learning disabilities and things like that. Obviously having to learn how to cope with that and speak out and learning about other issues as a result of that. But if, you're of these different things, naturally the issues unfortunately have a habit of finding you in this country where, if you are, it may be systemic racism, it may be the perpetual othering, it may be the model minority myth, it may be sexism, it may be any multitude of horrifying things that happen. But really what you have to think about is what are the things that do affect you that you want to work on? And with that, once you know your story that affects you, obviously, like, how do you find other people that are in that group to build community with, to build the persistence necessary to create that change? Because making change, in my view, if I was to put into metaphors, like trying to walk through a door that's closed constantly or most of the time, you have to build up the persistence to continue walking into it until one day it kind of opens slightly and then you hit it at just the right time. But in order to do that and get through the pain of literally walking into a door constantly, you have to have community around you that love and support you and let you know that if you need to step back because there is too much trauma involved in this, because these things are traumatic. For me, obviously, like it's gun violence. I have to set my own boundaries, but for many people, it's way more traumatic, right? Because they've been living this their entire lives. I've only been living this, since I was 17 years old. But for many people, because it's so intertwined with their identity, it is their entire lives, right? And you have to find the community necessary. In my view, I think this is best done through making a lot of food together and hanging out and partying, to build a micro scale level of the movement within your own community that people want to be part of because it's fun, not one that people feel like they have to be part of because it's traumatic and you need a virtue signal and all this other stuff. No, like you just need to give a shit and go out there and have friends and have fun while acknowledging, as dark as these things are, that ultimately, like, you have to have fun to get the just be strong enough to persist to get through all the screwed up things on top of the stuff you've already gone through to eventually succeed. And it's really through love that that's found as friends, and romantically too, like between people, if that's your thing, and like, I'm telling you, like, if it wasn't for my friends and, my girlfriend and stuff like that throughout time, like I would not be here right now. And that community is really the core component, I think, of what fixes all of this.
I did want to talk about well-being, especially since you brought up mass shooters manifestos. So what does a lot of what you just discussed, what you talked about was sort of individual things. Do you think that looking out for young people's well-being can be something that organizations plan for and have, strategies around? Is that a thing movement organizations should be thinking about, or is it always
Yes.
individual?
No, I think it has to be both. I think it has to be structured in somewhat of a way, but in a way that doesn't make it uncool or lame, which is difficult. But I think even doing anything right now is better than doing nothing, because right now so many of these organizations just don't do anything, period. Right. And it's better to have something that you can work towards fixing than something that doesn't exist at all and just helps continue perpetuating the problem in the first place. And I may not necessarily know what that looks like for Tufts or Circle or whatever it might be. But I think in the case of like most legacy organizations, like on campus, if you look around at them, at the ones that have lasted, like they have a standard set of training and like basically like introduction and stuff like that, and a passing down of institutional knowledge that I think is necessary, where you kind of shadow like the other person that you're replacing. And I think for most organizations, that's kind of like the necessary thing. And at a personal level too, it's about like, it's setting boundaries on the movement. I mean, a lot of the time, like I can't stand to be around other people in the movement. I got to be honest, because it is too much. And it's not that I don't love them. It's that it is exhausting hearing about the worst day of my life and thinking about that constantly, as it would be for anybody that's gone through any traumatic experience, even if it's not a school shooting, or even if it's not an instance of gun violence. It could be an instance of racial injustice, or what, just existing in this country for half of people now. And setting those boundaries is really critical. Like the hardest thing for me to learn in activism and organizing has been how to be a normal 22-year-old and a student, and understanding the value in that and not feeling guilty about it. Like I'm not hurting the movement, because I realize that I'm just one part of it, right? If I'm not taking care of myself, because movements are collective actions of people, if you all are not taking care of yourselves as each person, because you are the movement, you are not taking care of the movement. The movement is not taking care of itself. And in that way, not taking care of yourself, not setting those boundaries is the absolute most selfish and harmful thing you could do to the movement.
Thank you for centering joy and love. I think that means a lot to a lot of people in this room. You've mentioned other people in the movement. Are there, I'm wondering if there are other groups who you really look up to or feel like their history really informed your work. I listened to an interview that you gave about Erica Ford one time and didn't know if there's other folks that you wanted to amplify or lift up.
Yeah, no, I mean, really the people that I look to are the veterans and the people that created the gun violence prevention movement, which are Black women. Those have been my mentors really from the beginning, that have enabled me to continue doing this work more than anything, like Erica Ford. For those of you that don't know, Erica Ford is an amazing person who everybody should know when they think about gun violence prevention. She's been working using a model of restorative justice for the past 20 years in Jamaica, Queens, to help stop young people from shooting each other, where they don't necessarily focus on gun laws, but they focus on getting kids resources. Because the reason why places like Parkland don't have shootings on a daily basis isn't necessarily because we have stronger gun laws than most places in Miami-Dade County or whatever it is. It's because we have a ridiculous amount of resources because of systemic racism in comparison to many places in Miami-Dade County. Like the #1 predictor of where gun violence occurs in the United States is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s, right? These are big systemic issues that we have to address in a holistic manner, where it's not just how does somebody get a gun? Yeah, that might stop the shooting in Parkland, but it's not going to stop every single shooting that is possible. We have to take the same approach like we did with cigarettes, where it's how do we make them uncool so that kids don't want to pick them up or see them as a solution in the first place? And how do we make it so that we obviously address how people get them too on top of that? So it's not just how did the shooter at my high school get an AR-15? How do we address the systemic racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and xenophobia that motivated him, not mental illness, to pick up that gun in the first place, right? Because I don't care that therapy can be helpful for many things. We need societal change to address that level of hatred and systemic racism in the first place.
How did it feel to see the bipartisan gun bill pass?
Complicated, because it was definitely an ideological transition that I had had over the past 5 years that enabled me to even be comfortable with at all supporting that or being happy about it in any way. And what it came down to is like, after Parkland, we said like, screw it, like we want an assault weapons ban. That's it. Like screw everything else. We need an assault weapons ban. Ultimately, we raised the age to 21 and we passed a law that enables you to disarm people that threaten to kill other people. So for example, somebody sent a death threat to my mom that said, F with the NRA and you will be DOA. We used that law to disarm the person who lived about 20 minutes away from us and take all of his guns and several hundred rounds of ammunition that he could have used to kill my family, right? These laws work. No law is perfect, but they do work. And I think the reason why I say there was an ideological evolution there is that we have to ask ourselves, do we want to continuously put off saving any lives in order to pursue what could be a bigger goal in the future, or do we want to save lives right now? And what it came down to with this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is this can be this might save 1 or 2 lives or a couple of lives. And even if that's the case, if there are a couple of people that don't have to know the pain and suffering that many of my classmates and my sister and so many other people know, that's still a success, even if it doesn't immediately end gun violence, right? Because we're working against forces that have billions of dollars and have been around for over 100 years in this country, right? For us to be able to do that within 5 years of the shooting at my high school, and for the first time for most people in this room's lifetimes, that is success. We can use that infrastructure to then go and get more, but don't sacrifice getting more power when you aren't getting everything that you want. Because ultimately in democracy, I had a mentor that said this to me once, when you have 100% of the power, you can get 100% of what you want. When you have 50% of the power, you can get 50% of what you want. And ultimately, if we said, screw it, this is not an assault weapons ban, yeah, it might have felt good, but we wouldn't have saved any lives.
What made it happen in your view?
I think it was the immediate mobilization afterwards.
Yeah.
And also just the fact that historically we see more and more momentum on these things horribly, where it's oftentimes 6 months before an election, like it was after Parkland.
Mm-hmm.
And there were multiple instances of gun violence like Buffalo, Highland Park, and Uvalde that happen on top of each other that just keep it in the news, unfortunately, because they happen to disproportionately affect white communities. And that's what the media cares about, which is messed up, but it's the truth. And that helped it, along with the fact that I think, I do think March for Lives played some of a role. And that we had 450 marches. We talked to the Uvalde and Highland Park families, and they supported us and wanted us to do marches after their shootings so that we could help keep it in the media so that they could have time to grieve and also apply as much pressure as possible to get these 10 Republican senators on board. There were also some really high level meetings that I had in the immediate aftermath where I, went and talked with some unnamed, very powerful individuals and basically said, okay, we're going to go out to these 10 Republicans like offices in these different states and organize rallies there and bring out teachers unions and all the other groups that we can, like the NEA, the AFT and others, and just everyday people to show up and protest there. And the reason why I knew that it was going to be different, I said over and over again, this time is going to be different. This time is going to be different. Really hoping I was not going to be proven wrong. And luckily I was not. It's because when we were in Texas, it was the first time I had ever been there in Dallas, Texas, where we were not counter-protested by 40 plus men and women with AR-15s screaming that we were crisis actors paid off by the CIA or whatever 3-letter agency, the FDA or whatever, that you can imagine. They're conspiracy theorists. They're weird and not, clearly got a screw loose or something. But there was not a single one of them there. And I literally, like when I applied to college, like one of the essays that I wrote, I titled How to Talk to People That Want to Kill You. And I talked about an interaction that I had had with an armed group of people outside of one of our protests in Texas, where they were screaming my name and my classmates' names, saying, "You're a bunch of, CIA, whatever." So we're 18 years old. And I go out to them and I'm like, why do you think this stuff, right? And they, they're like, well, you're trying to take our guns away. And I said, I'm like, sir, are you trying to like kill yourself? Or you're trying to harm somebody else? Did you threaten to shoot up a school recently or something? It's like, no, of course not. I'm God, gun loving, Jesus loving patriot, whatever. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not trying to take your guns away. And I was like, do you think somebody like the shooter at my high school who threatened to shoot up my school multiple times should be able to keep the same type of gun that he used, like you're holding in your hands right now? No, and he can't. I was like, actually, he can in Texas. And we're trying to change that. He's like, well, wait, really? I'm like, yeah. And the way it works is basically as a court order with a right to due process where somebody essentially is proven to be a danger to themselves or others and they can't have those guns anymore. It's like, well, I support that. I'm like, okay, cool. So you actually agree with us. And he ended up crying after basically threatening to kill us as we were out there. And I realized from that conversation with so many of these people, let me put a little asterisk by that. There's obviously an enormous amount of privilege that goes into being able to have that conversation as a cishet white man going out there. But it's also, I feel like, my duty to be able to have those conversations that many of my friends and allies within the movement can't. And it's not that we need to convince those people that are on that side. It's just to say, hatred is a defense mechanism. And when you disprove the reasons why people don't need to hate you a lot of the time, when you don't immediately attack them and you just ask them even the most basic of questions, that hatred comes from fear, right? That fear is driven by a lack of education or a just not understanding what's actually going on. And when you explain to people what you actually are standing for, which is these basic things, and don't say like, yeah, we're going to agree today that you're going to turn in your AR-15 or whatever, but really just focus on those basic things, then we can start to make some type of progress at that level, even if it's not everything. Because I can respect people that don't agree with me. I've had to work with Senate Republicans for, like that's not easy. I can respect people that don't agree with me, but I can't accept the fact that we can't do anything to stop these things from happening, right? And I think so long as we keep bringing it back to that point, that reframing that messaging of like just say no to everything, is that the NRA is saying no to saving kids like or young people's lives like ours, and older people in everybody's lives, because they want to protect things like an AR-15 more than my sister.
Y'all get your questions ready. I have 2 more questions for you, David. One is, speaking of standing up for issues, my amazing colleague, Sarah, and others in our office did a pretty amazing job on a report about young people running for office, and that issues are motivating.
Did you talk about Maxwell?
We are definitely talking about Maxwell. And for those of you who don't know, Maxwell Alejandro Frost was the first organizing director.
Yes. So Maxwell, I'll do the sales pitch. I did a lot of call time, so I'm good at this now. Maxwell is our first national organizing director for March for Our Lives. He was this time last year, as an example of like why you should always, like, if there's even a shot of making any change, even if it seems like it's not going to happen and it's impossible, you should still try to do it. This time last year, Maxwell was running for Congress, and I was on his kitchen cabinet. And I was on his kitchen cabinet calls every single Thursday morning, I think it was, at 9 a.m. in my dining hall, talking with like everybody about how to get him elected. He had less than $5,000, no experience in political office whatsoever. We had to work to get him as campaign manager and everything. And through that process, over that time, like we even had a fundraiser in Cambridge. I asked every student that I could find, like at school, like, hey, will you guys come and help on this campaign? Nobody was like, yeah, he doesn't have a shot. Like, we're not going to help him at all, basically. Because they're like, at Harvard, it's like, oh, you can go and work with Bill de Blasio, or you can go and work with other big name or whatever, right? And now everybody's like, wow, did you guys hear about this Maxwell guy? So the reality is Maxwell ended up outraising everybody else in the race by a massive amount. And he defeated 2 former members of Congress and one of the most politically powerful people in the state as an Afro-Cuban kid, basically. He's 25 now, but he was 24 when he was running, and he was an Uber driver and was basically couch surfing because he couldn't live at his house because it was like COVID and stuff, and his grandma lives there. So he was basically couch surfing in other friends' places as an Uber driver doing call time. And he ended up getting elected, and he's in a +14 district. So basically the primary is the election. He's very likely going to be the first Gen Z member of Congress and the first Afro-Cuban person in Congress. But I say that to say, when you see these opportunities, even if you don't think it has any shot, honestly, I was kind of amazed when Maxwell got elected. I'm still in kind of disbelief because it was such a long shot, right? Take those risks. Worst case scenario, you'll learn some things, and go and help elect people at state legislatures. Honestly, Congress is great. Maxwell's a great symbolic win, but ultimately we have to win state legislatures. Change is way more possible in the Sacramentos and Bostons and Richmonds and other state capitals across the country than it is in Congress. And you can win those races for a lot less. And in a lot of them, you only need to be 18 or 21 to run. So go and call up your friends in those states.
Well, I want to dig into this just a little bit more, though, because one of the things that Sarah and my colleagues found, though, was that young people who are gender minorities, LGBT folks, young people of color are more likely to report perceiving barriers to running for office. And
because there are.
Yeah. So what do you think needs to change for us to diversify who's elected?
I think we need, until we address the incredibly messed up system of campaign. For those of you that don't know, pretty much every congressman or member of Congress is a glorified fundraiser. That is what they spend the vast majority of their time doing. They're not talking to constituents. They're calling rich people and asking them for money every single goddamn day. It's terrible. But the reality is, until those donors, who are the people who have the actual power in our political system beyond the voters, start investing in candidates like Maxwell and candidates who are going to change, are essentially going to bite the hand that feeds and change that system that got them there in the first place, it's going to remain a predominantly cishet white male space. That's the bottom line, right? And on top of that, like, we have a whole, there's whole issues of other systemic issues that play into that.
Right.
Lack of generational wealth, lack of, systemic racism, even property values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything that plays into that, where it just makes it that much harder for people to run for office. And I think there's some organizations out there that specifically work, I think it's like Emily's List and others,
Mm-hmm.
who work to help elect people in those different minority positions as women or people of color and things like that.
Yep.
And that's great, but they need more funding. And until we start getting way more, either us, I don't know about you guys, but until you want to start shelling out $200 a month to help fund those things, they're going to need a lot of really wealthy people to fund those things in the first place.
Okay. Final question from me. So far this year, there's been 482 mass shootings. Our audience tonight is full of educationally privileged folks who know how to navigate systems. What are 3 specific things that all of us can do to move the needle on violence prevention?
Well, one, I wouldn't just say register to vote and vote. Vote in primaries in Massachusetts. I know it seems like your vote won't matter that much in the general. For governor, it definitely does. But your vote really is the most important election for most of you in terms of who actually represents you is the primary. And what I would say is, like, if you guys aren't happy with who, I mean, personally, my representative is Marjory Decker, and I think she's done a pretty good job personally. But if you aren't happy with whoever your state legislator is, just file somebody to run for office against them, even if they can't raise any money. Because if you can just raise enough hell in the press to pressure them in that primary, you can get a lot of them to shift pretty quickly, right? And it's not until we start doing that ourselves that they're going to start really changing seriously. But you got to see those. You have to turn out and vote in primary elections. So that's the first thing. Register to vote and vote in primary elections if you're in Massachusetts. If you live in another state, vote in that state, please. Because Massachusetts, your vote counts, but there's a lot of states, because of our weird non-proportional system of government, that your state, because we let land vote in this country, your vote can have a lot more impact possibly where you actually reside rather than just where you go to college. And 2, I would say with that, just find something like I said, that's related to your own identity or not, that you want to support, and just go and work on it, even if it's at a small scale, and realize that marches aren't made possible because one guy says, like, we're going to march or whatever. They're made possible because 800 people around the world and the US said, okay, like, we have no idea who these kids from Parkland really are, but we understand their story and we understand that this is a call to action and we're going to do it. And that's how you make 800 marches in 6 weeks and getting 1 million people to Washington, D.C. possible, is that those people took it upon themselves to make that change with that call to action. Most major change is not going to happen in a super centralized way with some organization. As great as March for Our Lives is, the real power of March for Our Lives comes from the people. It's because we are an organization that supports the movement, not an organization that tries to be the movement, right?
Ooh, that's a very big difference.
Yes, very big.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I would say, is like picking up that call to action when it's out there, and also just doing it in your own community. Just start, whatever you're passionate about, figure out whatever the political dynamic is around it and how to pressure those people. And they move pretty easily eventually with enough time.
Thank you so much, David. All right. We got Jess and Shanley in the crowd. With anyone have a question, you can raise your hand. Just a quick reminder, please focus on your question, share your name, and please remain respectful. We have 2 people in the middle here and 1 person over here, or 2 people over here.
This is my first time speaking in like 3 years, so sorry if I'm like going on and on a lot. So.
Hi, my name is Siona, and I just wanted to ask, so you said, voting in primaries is really important. And like, I'm from Wisconsin, where I guess voting is a little bit less encouraged overall for young people, just like on a state governmental level.
Because your vote matters a lot more there.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. So, when I was in high school, a lot of my friends were all registering to vote and voting for the first time. And I just think there's a lot of challenges when you're getting your ballot for the first time, and like the research about who you're voting for isn't necessarily very accessible. So what do you think should be done to mitigate those challenges because I feel like a lot of times young people don't vote because they don't know who to vote for, especially in primaries. So what do you think should be done to mitigate those challenges?
I think what I would do is basically set up a system where for the people in your state or even just your community, and this is what I talk about when starting small, get as many people as you can to get their mail-in ballots so they have time to do research and everything like that at home. And then with that, you can put together a educational thing that can go viral on Instagram within your own community. That's here's where all of these politicians stand and who I think you should vote for or whatever it is. And sure, you may not get 1 billion people to vote or whatever it is, right? But if you can start changing, 20 people's minds or 40, if you create something that can scale infinitely because it's just on the internet and it shows young people how to vote and how to get their mail-in ballot, all of a sudden you can then change how 20,000 young people vote if 20,000 people see that and then get their ballot that way. And in Wisconsin, that may be enough to change a presidential election. That may be enough to change who's governor. And there's a lot of power in that. So it's about thinking about what is a small thing that you can do that can scale without you having to scale with it, that people can just take and run with it. It's like the marches, right? We didn't organize all of those marches ourselves. We helped offer support if needed in the background, with permitting, because there was a 12-year-old in Oakland, California. That's I'm good. This is a true story. It's I'm going to organize a march. And we're okay, great. Here's how you file for a permit. You're going to work with your dad, here, all this stuff, right? And that's what I mean. You have to build something that can then scale beyond that. So I would think about how to create an Instagram post that's just basically a political educational tool and get your friends who have followings to share it and get other people to share it. Basically create a pyramid scheme, but for social change.
Yeah. And also get people involved before they're 18. We talk about growing voters all the time.
And encourage people just to look up the candidates as well. Half the time, when I go into the ballot box, maybe this isn't the best thing. I just look up the candidates on my phone if I don't know who somebody is. And I go through their campaign website and I see who's endorsed them, and that can be somewhat helpful.
If you're really interested in this issue, there's a group called Jumbo Vote out of Tisch College that you can join. So stop by Barnum Hall. Next question. We should probably go over towards this way. Yeah.
Thank you, David, for coming to Tufts. I'm Nick. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious with how deeply sensitive and personal many of these issues in our climate are, whether it be gun violence, abortion, etc. Where do you see the balance between compromise and sticking to principle?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think it's about getting as much power as you can. If you're able to create change right now, because obviously with stuff like the Supreme Court, that is a major problem that we're going to need to address for our country to exist long term, along with a multitude of other ones, because it's such an anti-democratic institution that has basically become a system for constitutional referendums, essentially, for our country. That is ridiculous. But either way, I think in the case of I can't speak to the abortion stuff, but I can speak to my own experience with the gun stuff, which is basically that some progress is better than none, right? I think a lot of the people who think to themselves, like I did at one time, we're not going to raise the age to 21 unless we also ban assault weapons or something like that, oftentimes haven't actually made that change a lot of the time, because you realize that change is something that it's like compounding interest, right? You have to make that change continuously over time. And that's the one asset everybody in this, most of us in this room have on our side, that is the most powerful asset to have in politics, besides several $1 billion and the Koch brothers behind you, is time on our sides. In some ways we don't have that, but in many ways we do, right? We're going to, thank God, outlive Justice Roberts, right? And everybody on the Supreme Court. The question that our generation faces is, are we going to repeat the same mistakes of previous generations? Are we going to mistake winning a battle as winning the war, right? Because I think that's been the problem historically with a lot of these social movements is, frankly, liberals come along and write all of these amazing historical books about how we saved everything and we addressed systemic racism through the civil rights movement. And yes, the civil rights movement, incredible, right? But it's also important to note, because of the massive amount of trauma that comes with that, the infiltration by the US government through programs like COINTELPRO, the killing of people like Fred Hampton and many others who we don't know the names of, those movements may have ended up winning in the textbooks, but long-term, the conservative reaction with anti-busing, I mean, look at the history of Boston, right? Is so massive that we mistake winning that battle as winning the war, when really conservatives have won the war. But luckily, it's, you know, after you've reached checkmate, it's time for a new chess game. It's just that the problem is when the other side is literally trying to flip the chessboard and you've only now started to play chess. But that's kind of what I see, is like, get it, whatever progress you can make right now, get that, and then talk about how you can build your power more.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question. Yeah, Jess, you want to go in the back? Mhm.
Hello. Hi. I'm Valerie Infante. I'm a senior here at Tufts. And I'm Puerto Rican. And so you're talking about Hispanic invasion. Yeah, that I know I'm white, but like that hit home to me. How do you suggest people that can't vote to like help out? And also, how do you convince people in a PWI to like care about your communities as a cishet white man?
Wait, what was the second part before you said?
How do you get, to be frank, white people to care about causes of minority groups?
Thank you for that question.
So the first part was about creating change with voting, right? Sorry. Without being able to vote. Yeah, because that's right. Gotta love US imperialism. Yeah, sorry, I had so many things come back to me from my history of the US and like US empire in Latin America class from last year that, man, anyways, I think one of the things that you have to think about, that's where primaries can be helpful, right? If you can't vote, right? But if you start challenging members of Congress in the Massachusetts state congressional primaries to say, hey, we're going to run somebody against you if you don't support, I mean, I don't know if you support this, but as an example, Puerto Rican statehood.
I don't support it.
Okay. Well, whatever stance it is, you know, that you have on it, running people against, you know, those other candidates to pressure them to advance whatever agenda you want, Puerto Rican independent, whatever it might be in the first place. And that's what I would say to do, is like help register those voters to then apply that pressure. And like, you literally don't need to raise that much money to actually, you just need to raise hell in the press to help push these other candidates within the primary. And that's kind of what I would say to that. And then in terms of getting other people to care in the white community, yeah, it's a very, I don't want to mess up this answer because it's very important. I think it's just about just leading by example, I would say, and also understanding that I am far from perfect. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I will always, the rest of my life will be spent unlearning the constant structures that are put in place that I've come to assume as normal, not only around being like a cis white guy, but also being a heterosexual like white guy as well, and unlearning those things, and even the way that those impact relationships, and you know, just all these different things in the first place. And I think it's leading by example, and also calling out other white people when they do messed up stuff and being like, actually, that was really racist. And let me break down, you know, but also not doing it in a way where it's just like you're calling out somebody to just virtue signal, kind of, where it's like, I want to explain to you why this is hurtful to other people so that you don't do it. Because I think a lot of the time, if you just blatantly say, I don't know, like that was racist, even if it was true, white people are so ridiculously sensitive. It is insane and fragile. And it's kind of like you have to figure out how to get the same effect without just making yourself feel better by saying somebody else is racist or intolerant or whatever it might be, even if it is true. And maybe that's wrong of me to say. I don't know. But you asked me this question, so don't attack me on it.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your frankness. First of all, I appreciate it. And second of all, I take this opportunity for anyone who has the money to donate to Puerto Rico. We just went through a hurricane. Thank you.
So Jess, do we have time for one more question? Okay. Do you want to go in the back over there?
Hi, my name is Havel. So I've been hearing a lot of discourse, like about increasing law enforcement in schools, and especially like in Tufts campus. I know that that's the debate that's been going on a lot in and out of like clubs and different organizations. So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about like increasing law enforcement as like not as an excuse, but like as a way of fighting or like trying to decrease the amount of mass shootings or potential shootings that there could be in on-campus spaces.
Terrible idea. I understand that there's always going to be some role, in my view, of that, you know, like my dad was an FBI agent, so forgive me for any biases that I have here, but I've also done a lot of work too to understand like the dynamics of the deeply dark origins of where our current system originates from. Even if those people are not necessarily themselves the people that created that system, they're still, you know, with it in the first place. But I think personally, I don't know, most cops that I've talked to, including my own father, support stronger gun laws in the first place because they don't want to be put in danger either, right? I think the thing though is that if we just address this problem by putting more cops on campuses, we need to ask ourselves, what is that actually doing, right? There was a cop on my campus. How many cops are outside of Uvalde? Who are we actually keeping safe here besides the state and white people, generally speaking? Because I don't know what the answer is, because they failed at my high school. They failed in Uvalde, and they failed many, many other times. And of course, there are exceptions to that, but those successes of them actually successfully stopping a mass shooting before it happens are the exception and not the rule. And I think that money would be far better spent investing in what most likely people in this room, of any of you, like the most likely thing that you guys would die of in terms of gun deaths by far is gun suicide. Investing that money in mental health to address in a non-stigmatory way where it's like, oh, like, yes, mental illness does have a role to play in addressing gun deaths, but it's not by treating white supremacists as being mentally ill just so that we don't have to talk about white supremacy in the first place and the structural factors that play into gun violence, right? We need to invest in the prevention of these things and not just responding to them, right? If we could, it's like, instead of building buildings with fire escapes and, you know, extinguishers and stuff, let's just hire more firefighters. Because that makes sense, right? Because then maybe instead of 1,000 people dying, it will be 900 people that die. That's still a failure in my book. And if we really want, if we truly are dedicated to building even if historically this is the opposite of what the United States has been, a truly just and equitable society that promotes the justice for all individuals, regardless of color, class, or creed, we have to invest in actually preventing these things and not just bullshit security theater, to be honest, which is what it is. It might make some white students feel better, but ultimately it's at the cost of many, many other students in the first place. And of course, somebody does need to respond if there is somebody with an AR-15 on campus, obviously. But as we've seen with Uvalde, as we've seen with all these other instances, the reason why other countries don't have school shootings isn't because they have more cops in the United States, or they imprison more people, or they have less mental illness. It's because they address the guns. So that's my view of it. I don't think campuses need more cops.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for all of your questions. And thank you, David, so much for making this your first speaking engagement in 3 years. We
I hope I did okay.
Value your time.